Hello and welcome to another Josh Plays 40k painting tutorial. Tonight we'll be painting the Terminators from the Leviathan box set. Really nice new sculpts of these models, and I know they have been very popular and were long awaited since their tease in the upcoming videos that were set before the box set's release. So without further ado, let's grab some brushes and get started. So as you can see here, I've built the model and got it sprayed up in Macragge Blue. Now you will notice that he is currently missing a head, and that is because I have left it separate and actually sprayed this in the new white Scar as an undercoat. This just sort of saving some time in having to paint it white, which is quite a difficult colour to get right the first time, especially when you're sort of blocking it in. So I thought leave it separate and spray it up differently. I had that at my disposal. If you don't, then brushing it on is fine, but obviously just make sure that you give yourself at least 2 or 3 coats depending on what white paint you use. Now with the paint scheme I'm going for tonight is actually one of my own for my own Space Marine chapter. It is very close to Ultramarines in terms of that its base colour is blue. But there are a few differences that I have with the scheme. For instance, my pauldrons are actually a grey rather than blue themselves, as are the knee pads, and my trims are silver rather than gold for the equivalent, and silver on the icon for the Terminators in particular. Rather than the sort of bony white colour that they go for the Ultramarines and standard schemes. So I will obviously point these out when I get to these stages, so that you can obviously deviate to the Ultramarines if that's what you're looking for. But what we'll do is we'll crack on and get started, and then we can pick out those details as we go. So the first paint we're going to use is a contrast of Black Legion, and this is to sort of block in all those sort of cloth areas between the armour panelling. This sort of flows in quite nicely in comparison to using Abaddon Black. So we're going to just focus, as I say, on those cloth areas that we're doing. So particularly for these models, it's between the sort of tops of the legs and around the sort of groin area here. So just let that slot in. If you do make any mistakes, then it is definitely worth having a pot of Macragge Blue on hand to tidy up and fill any in. Then you shouldn't be too bad with this, but occasionally you will have a little bit of overhang with the brush. So once you've finished up with that Black Legion, we're going to move on to filling in the rest of the black details now, but this time we're going to move on to Abaddon Black. And this is to pick out predominantly the weapon of the Marine. So we're looking at all the casing. So basically we can obviously pick out the rest of the details as we go. So we're looking just to coat all over the weapon and get a nice smooth finish as you go around. So you might need a couple of coats going over the top of this blue with the black just to get a nice sort of smooth finish. But do take your time and sort of work your way around, and then we can move on to the next colour. Now the next colour I'm moving on to is Mechanicus Standard Grey. Now this is a fundamental part of my own scheme rather than the Ultramarines or any of the other chapters. So if you are sort of following on for my scheme for my Iron Walkers, you're obviously more than welcome. But if you're doing an Ultramarine scheme, then I would suggest sort of skipping ahead to the Leadbelcher, which will be next. So, but otherwise, with the Mechanicus Standard Grey, I pick out the knee pads on my Space Marines predominantly because they just to sort of break up the blue panelling, and then I also do the shoulder pauldrons as well. And with the Primaris Marines, there's a couple of little details that I have picked out in this colour, but predominantly for these Terminators, it will just be the knee pads and the shoulder pauldrons. Everything else will stay as it is. So if you are following this, obviously just take your time, work your way across. I do usually find that a couple of coats of the grey is needed to get a nice smooth transition from the blue, but otherwise I will see you at the next stage of Leadbelcher. Once you've finished off that Mechanicus standard grey, we're then going to move on to putting in some of the silver details. Now predominantly you will do the same, but where I will again differ just ever so slightly is where you would on the sort of iconry here, on the shoulder pad and on the knee pad, you would do that predominantly like a sort of white colour, something like that for Ultramarines, and you would also do the Aquila in a gold. So I would recommend Retributor Gold for that. Mine are silver, so as a base. So this, I think it does look really nice against the blue, which is again why I chose the scheme I did. But the parts you're going to want to focus on for the weapon, particularly, is the barrels on the front and the very rear part of the Stormbolter, which obviously houses where the mechanism is more exposed, like with a lot of standard bolters. Again, sort of then turning to the back of the model, you'll want to sort of very gently just pick out the sort of grains on the vents on the back of the torso, as well as the cables and pipes coming out the backs of the arms. As I say, I'm using Leadbelcher for this. Do obviously take your time, sort of work your way around the model, and then we can come back for the next stage. It's also worth noting when you've got the Leadbelcher out to pick out some of the facial mask details as well. So this is quite a small area on the face mask, but predominantly it's the sort of breathing apparatus at the very front here. So you'll want to give that a coat of Leadbelcher as well. So just sort of carefully going between the lines. If you do make any mistakes, obviously you can neaten back up again with white scar before moving on to the sort of shading and highlighting stages, but do try and be as neat as possible, because obviously this will save you a lot more time. Once you've applied all that Leadbelcher and you've tidied up any little errors, we're going to move on to Wraithbone, and this is just to coat over any sort of purity seals that your model may have. So obviously do the scripture part as well as the seal at the top, and just give this a nice even coat over. You might find that you'll want a couple of passes at this with the Wraithbone, but do try and be as neat as possible, and again you can tidy up if necessary. Then the last base coat we're going to apply is Balthazar Gold, and this is over the bullets of the Stormbolter itself. So you'll want a nice small brush for this. I'm using a small layer brush just to obviously try and pick out the raised areas of those bullets. But do take your time and just work your way around both sides of the Stormbolter. Now the next stage we're going to move on to is some shading, and for this we're going to use Nun Oil, and this is going to be used in a couple of different ways. Firstly, we're going to do a wash over the silver details that I've done. Now for you, if you've used the gold for Ultramarines, I would recommend using Reikland Flesh Shade, but otherwise you would use the Nun Oil on the sort of silver parts of the weapon, as well as the cables and the backpack as well. So there's not too many differences between what you'd be doing for Ultramarines as well. But what we're also going to do, and this will apply to any scheme really with the blue, and that is to pick out some recess shading. So we're going to get just a little bit of Nun Oil on the brush, and we're just going to pick out those recesses. So for instance, around the tip of the sort of head crest here, and particularly around the sort of cabling on the legs. So just to sort of give them a bit more definition, to make them, they're already obviously 3D, but to really pick them out so that they stand out, as well as sort of picking out any of these armour panellings as well. Now don't worry if you go over a little bit like I just did there. You can always neaten up again with Macragge Blue before moving on to highlighting. That is why we do these steps so early on with the base coating, so that we don't have to worry too much about the neatness. Obviously it saves you time, but at the same time you can obviously enjoy the benefit of being able to neaten up as well as you go. So work your way around the model. Now you will find this will be quite a time consuming step, but it really does help with the overall finish of the model, and will give you a much more in-depth finish to what you're doing. So what we're also then going to do with the Nunn oil, aside from picking out the shades on the main miniature, is not forgetting the head here, and we're going to be doing very similar with the recess shading here as we did before. So picking out any particular points, and I apologise if this doesn't show up terribly well on camera, but we are going to, there's the sort of mouth grooves in there, and again just sort of drop the Nunn oil into those and it will help just pick out those recesses. And again, like before, don't worry too much about the neatness. We can always come back in with White Scar and tidy up at a later point. So as I say, work your way around very carefully, and then we can move on to highlighting. So next up we're going to grab a little bit of Agrax Earthshade, and this is just to go over the bullets in the Stormbolter. So you won't need a lot of this, we're just looking to pick out the detail in there and just to get the recesses on that. So obviously not forgetting to do both sides. Obviously, thankfully, with the casing of the gun being black, if we do get a little bit on the black, thankfully it won't make much difference, because obviously it's already a very dark colour, so it's not very easy to spot. The next shade we're going to do is Skeleton Horde, and this is on the parchment of the purity seals that you'll have around the models. I do know they're not all in the same place, but obviously you'll have picked those out with Wraithbone already, and just coat that over the top, and that gives a nice sort of warm parchment feel to it. And then finally, for those seals on the purity seals, we're going to get a little bit of Volupus Pink and just coat that over the top. I might need a little bit more than that. So once you've got all those shades applied, and you've gone back over with Macragge Blue and White Scar, just to touch up any areas that you didn't want those shades to be on, we're going to start the highlighting process. And for this we're going to start off with the blue armour, and the highlight we're going to use is Calgar Blue. This gives a nice sort of lighter texture to the blue overall, and picks out the edges very nicely. So what we're going to do, you want a nice sort of fine point to your brush, and a small brush at that, and work your way around the model, sort of finding any sort of sharp edges and points that you want to stand out a little bit more. So predominantly it's quite easy just to sort of go for any sort of straight edges that exist on the model. So the around the gauntlet here, for instance, with the Power Fist, or particularly these armour plates that are on the side. Now obviously you can do as much or as little of this as you wish, so there's these top parts here as well that you can make stand out, but do take your time. Obviously try and be as neat as possible. This is really the step where the model will really start to pop, and you'll certainly start noticing the differences as you work on it. So take your time, work your way around, and then we can move on to the next highlight. Once you're happy with that blue armour, we're going to move on to highlighting up the silver, and for this we're going to use Runed Fang Steel. Obviously if you're following an Ultramarine scheme, you will predominantly just be using this on the weapon itself. So picking out the tips of the barrels of the gun here, any of the other little sort of details that you've picked out with that. But obviously for myself, doing my own scheme, this will also include the iconry as well. So obviously the part on the knee pad here, and also on the shoulder and the Aquila as well. Now if you're doing Ultramarines, now for the Aquila and the gold areas, I'd definitely recommend using Liberator Gold, as that is a nice sort of shine finish to the model, and for your iconry on the legs and the arms here, I'd recommend a sort of slightly more off-white, so maybe Ulthuan grey, something like that, would be a really good highlight to the already sort of white base you've put down and shaded. Now we're going to go back to Mechanicus Standard Grey next, and this is to highlight up the black of the weapon casing itself. So just similar to with the blue armour, just picking out any of the sharp edges that go around the casing of the weapon with this paint, and that will give a nice sort of transition between the black tones. Next up we're going to get a little bit of Emperor's Children just to finish off those purity seals, and this is just for the seal itself, as a nice sort of round highlight to the edges of that, just to make that pop a little bit more against the armour. And then coming over to the head here, to finish this off, we're going to move on to a little bit of Mephiston red, and this is just for those eye sockets. Now I really would recommend a fine tip to your brush, and certainly having a very steady hand to pick out these lenses. Now obviously if you do make a mistake, you can neaten up with white scar. And then also with the Mephiston red, we will just pick out these little lens nodules on the corner of the shoulder here. So we're just gently coating that over the central part of what you've already put as silver. So the last highlight we're going to do, and this is just predominantly for my own scheme, and this is Dawnstone, and this is to go over the Mechanicus standard grey parts as a highlight for what I have already coated. So again, similar to before, this would just be an edge highlight, but obviously if you have been following an Ultramarines sort of idea, then you will have done this already with Liberator Gold, particularly for obviously the iconry at the front here, but you'd have done this with Calgar Blue as well for the shoulder pads. So obviously if you've not following on to this part, you don't need to worry about this step. So once you're happy with all those highlights, the next thing to do is to finish the assembly of the model, and then move on to basing the miniature in whichever way best fits your army. And there we have a finished Space Marine Terminator. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please leave a like and subscribe for more content to come. Any questions at all, please pop them in the comments below and I will be happy to come back to you. I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Bye.